Chapter 112. The North and the South seemed locked together like stags in mortal combat. Neither seemed able to mount a successful campaign to put the other away. Tom began to notice some despondency in his customers' conversations. It was a buoy to the hope yet strong in him for freedom. The family plunged into intense speculation when old George Johnson said mysteriously, "Mr. Murray done said I could go tend to some business. I be back just quick as I can." Then the next morning he was gone. What you reckon it is? Way he always talked, wasn't nothing left to take care of where he come from. Maybe something to do with his folks. But he ain't mentioned no folks, leastways not particular. He bound to got some somewhere. Maybe he done decided to go join the war. Well, I sure can't see old George wanting to shoot nobody. Spec he just finally got his belly full and we done seen the last of him. Oh, hush up, Ashford. You ain't never got nothing good to say about him or nobody else. Nearly a month had passed when one Sunday a whooping and hollering arose, for old George was back, grinning shamefacedly, and with him was a painfully shy creature of a girl as sallow and scrawny as himself, and her 8 months' pregnancy made her seem as if she had swallowed a pumpkin. "This is my wife, Miss Martha," old George Johnson told them. "Just before I left, we'd got married, and I told her I'd be back when I found us somewhere. How come I hadn't said nothing about a wife was it was hard enough to find anybody willing to have just me." He grinned at his Martha. "Why didn't you say hello to the folks?" Martha dutifully said hello to them all, and it seemed a long speech for her when she added, "George told me a lot about y'all." "Well, I hope whatever he told you was good," Matilda said brightly, and old George saw her glance a second time at Martha's extreme pregnancy. "I ain't knowed when I left we had a baby comin'. I just kept having a feelin' I better get back, and there she was in a family way." The fragile Martha seemed such a perfect match for old George Johnson that the family felt their hearts going out to the pair of them. "You mean you ain't even told Massa Murray?" asked Irene. "Nah, I ain't. Just said I had some business, same as I told y'all. If he want to run us off, we just have to go, that's all." "Well, I know Massa ain't gonna feel like that," said Irene, and Matilda echoed, "'cause he ain't. Massa ain't that kind of man." "Well, tell him I gotta see him first chance," said old George Johnson to Matilda. Leaving nothing to chance, Matilda first informed Mrs. Murray, somewhat dramatizing the situation. "Missy, I know he a overseer and all dat, but him and dat po' little wife of his'n just scairt to death Massa gonna make 'em leave 'cause he hadn't mentioned no wife befo' and times is so hard and all. And her time ain't far off neither. Well, of course I can't make my husband's decisions, but I'm sure he'll not put them out. Yes'm, I knowed y'all wouldn't, 'specially bein's how I spec she ain't no more'n 13 or 14 years old, missus, and lookin' ready to have dat baby any minute, and done just got here and don't know nobody 'ceptin' us and y'all." Mrs. Murray said, "Well, as I say, it's not my affair, it's Mr. Murray's decision, but I do feel certain they can stay on." Returning to the Slave Row, Matilda told a grateful old George Johnson not to worry, that Mrs. Murray had expressed certainty there would be no problem. Then she hurried to Irene's cabin, where after quick consultation, the two of them ambled over to the converted small shed behind the barn where the old George Johnsons were. Irene knocked, and when old George Johnson came to the door, she said, "We worried 'bout yo' wife. Tell her we do y'all's cookin' and washin', 'cause she got to save up what strength she got to have y'all's baby." "She's sleep now. She'll 'preciate it," he said, "'cause she been throwin' up a lot ever since we got here." "Ain't no wonder. She don't look to have hardly the strength of a bird," said Irene. "You ain't had no business bringin' her all that long way right this time nohow," Matilda added severely. "Tried my best to tell her that when I went back, but she wouldn't have it no other way. S'pose somethin' would 'a' happened. You don't know nothin' in the world 'bout deliverin' no baby," exclaimed Matilda. He said, "I can't hardly believe I'm going to be no daddy nohow." "Well, you show 'bout to." Irene nearly laughed at old George's worried expression. Then she and Matilda turned and headed back to their cabins. She and Matilda worried privately. "The po' gal don't look no ways right to me," Matilda muttered in confidence. "Can nigh see her bones, and 'spect it way too late to get her built up right." "Feel like she gonna have a mighty hard time," Irene prophesied. "Lawd, I sho ain't never thought I'd end up likin' no po' white folks." Less than 2 more weeks had passed when one midday Martha's pains began. The whole Slave Row family heard her agony from within the shed, as Matilda and Irene labored with her on through the night until shortly before the next noon. Finally, when Irene emerged, her face told the haggard old George Johnson, even before her mouth could form the words, "Believe Miss Martha gon' pull through. Yo' baby was a gal, but she dead." Chapter 113. The late afternoon of the 1863 New Year's Day, Matilda came almost flying into the slave row. "Y'all seen dat white man just rid in here? Y'all ain't gonna believe. He in there cussin' to massa. It just come over the railroad telegraph wire. President Lincoln done signed Emancipation Proclamation dat set us free." The galvanizing news thrust the Black Murrays among the millions more like them exulting wildly within the privacy of their cabins, but with each passing week the joyous awaiting of freedom dwindled, diminished, and finally receded into a new despair the more it became clear that within the steadily more bloodied, ravaged Confederacy, the presidential order had activated nothing but even more bitter despising of President Lincoln. So deep was the despair in the Murray slave row that despite Tom's intermittent reports of the Yankees winning major battles, including even the capture of Atlanta, they refused to build up their freedom hopes any more until toward the end of 1864, when they had not seen Tom so excited for almost 2 years. He said that his white customers were describing how untold thousands of murderous, pillaging Yankees, marching 5 miles abreast under some insane General Sherman, were laying waste to the state of Georgia. However often the family's hopes had previously been dashed, they scarcely could suppress their renewed hope of freedom as Tom brought subsequent nightly reports. "Sound like the Yankees ain't leavin' nothin'. Dem white men swears they burnin' the fields, the big houses, the barns, they killin' the mules and cookin' the cows and everything else they can eat. Whatever they ain't burnin' and eatin', dey's just ruinin', plus stealin' anything they can tote off. And dey says it's all out in the woods and roads, thick as ants that done left dey masses and plantations to follow dem Yankees till dat General Sherman hisself beggin' 'em to go back where dey come from." Then not long after the Yankees' triumphal march had reached the sea, Tom breathlessly reported Charleston done fell, and next General Grant done took Richmond. And finally in April of 1865, General Lee done surrendered the whole Confederacy army. The South done give up. The jubilance in the slave row was beyond any measure now as they poured out across the big house front yard and up the entry lane to reach the big road to join the hundreds already there, milling about, leaping and springing up and down, whooping, shouting, singing, preaching, praying. Free, Lord, free! Thank God Almighty, free at last! But then within a few days the spirit of celebration plunged into deep grief and mourning with the shattering news of the assassination of President Lincoln. "Evil!" shrieked Matilda as the family wept around her, among the millions like them who had revered the fallen president as their Moses. Then in May, as it was happening all across the defeated South, Massa Murray summoned all of his slaves into the front yard that faced the big house. When they were all assembled in a line, they found it hard to look levelly at the drawn, shocked faces of the Massa, the weeping Mrs. Murray, and the old George Johnsons, who, too, were white. In an anguished voice then, Massa Murray read slowly from the paper in his hand that the South had lost the war. Finding it very hard not to choke up before the black family standing there on the earth before him, he said, "I guess it means y'all as free as us. You can go if you want to, stay on if you want, and whoever stays will try to pay you something." The Black Murrays began leaping, singing, praying, screaming anew, "We's free, free at last! Thank you, Jesus!" The wild celebration's sounds carried through the open door of the small cabin where Lily Sue's son, Uriah, now 8 years of age, had laid for weeks, suffering a delirium of fever. "Freedom! Freedom!" Hearing it, Uriah came boiling up off his cot, his nightshirt flapping. He raced first for the pig pen, shouting, "Ole pigs, quit gruntin'! You's free!" He coursed to the barn. "Ole cows, quit givin' milk! You's free!" The boy raced to the chickens next. "Ole hens, quit layin'! You's free! And so's me!" But that night, with their celebration having ended in their sheer exhaustion, Tom Murray assembled his large family within the barn to discuss what they should do now that this long-awaited freedom had arrived. "Freedom ain't gonna feed us, it just let us decide what we wants to do to eat," said Tom. "We ain't got much money, and sides me blacksmithin' and Mammy cookin', the only workin' we knows is in the fields." He appraised their dilemma. Matilda reported that Massa Murray had asked her to urge them all to consider his offer to parcel out the plantation, and he would go halves with anyone interested in sharecropping. There was a heated debate. Several of the family's adults wished to leave as quickly as possible. Matilda protested. "I wants this family to stay together. Now about this talk o' movin', s'pose we did and y'all's pappy Chicken George get back, and nobody could even tell him which way we'd gone." Quiet fell when Tom made it clear he wished to speak. "Gonna tell y'all how come we can't leave yet. It's 'cause we just ain't no ways ready. Whenever we get ourselves ready, I'll be the first one to want to go." Most were finally convinced that Tom talked good sense, and the family meeting broke up. Taking Irene by the hand, Tom went walking with her in the moonlight toward the fields. Vaulting lightly over a fence, he took long strides, made a right-angle turn, and paced off a square. Then striding back toward the rail fence, he said, "Irene, that's going to be ours." She echoed him softly, "Ours." Within a week, the family's separate units were each working their fields. A morning when Tom had left his blacksmith shop to help his brothers, he recognized a lone rider along the road as the former cavalry Major Cates, his uniform tattered and his horse spavined. Cates also recognized Tom, and riding near the fence, he reined up. "Hey, bring me a dipper full of your water," he called. Tom looked at the nearby water bucket, then he studied Kate's face for a long moment before moving to the bucket. He filled the dipper and walked to hand it to Cates. "Things is changed now, Mr. Cates," Tom spoke evenly. "The only reason I brought you this water is because I'd bring any thirsty man a drink, not because you hollered. I just want you to know that." Cates handed back the dipper. "Get me another one." Tom took the dipper and dropped it back into the bucket and walked off, never once looking back. But when another rider came galloping and hallooing along the road with a battered black derby distinguishable above a faded green scarf, those out in the fields erupted into a mass foot race back toward the old slave row. "Mammy, he's back! He's back!" When the horse reached the yard, Chicken George's sons hauled him off onto their shoulders and went trooping with him to the weeping Matilda. "What you bellerin' for, woman?" he demanded in mock indignation, hugging her as if he would never let go. But finally he did, yelling to his family to assemble and be quiet. "Tell you all later about all the places I been and things I done since we last seen one another," hollered Chicken George. "But right now I gotta acquaint you with where we's all goin' together." In pin-drop quiet, and with his born sense of drama, Chicken George told them now that he had found for them all a western Tennessee settlement whose white people anxiously awaited their arrival to help build a town. "Let me tell y'all somethin'. The land where we goin' so black and rich, you plant a pig's tail and a hog'll grow. You can't hardly sleep nights, for the watermelons growin' so fast they cracks open like firecrackers. I'm tellin' you it's possums layin' under simmons trees too fat to move, with the simmon sugar drippin' down on 'em thick as 'lasses." The family never let him finish in their wild excitement. As some went dashing off to boast to others on adjacent plantations, Tom began planning that afternoon how to alter a farm wagon into a covered rockaway, of which about 10 could move all of the units of the family to this new place. But by that sundown a dozen other heads of newly freed families had come, not asking, but demanding that their families, too, were going. They were Black Holts, Fitzpatricks, Perms, Taylors, Wrights, Lakes, McGregors, and others from local Alamance County plantations. Amid the next 2 months of feverish activity, the men built the rockaways. The women butchered, cooked, canned, and smoked foodstuffs for travel and selecting what other vital things to take. Old Chicken George strode about, supervising every activity, loving his hero role. Tom Murray was thronged with volunteered assistance from yet more newly freed families, and with assurances that they would swiftly obtain their own wagons to become their families' rockaways. Finally he announced that all who wished could go, but that there must be but one rockaway per family unit. When at last 28 wagons were packed and ready to roll on the following sunup, in a strange calm sense of sadness, the freed people went about gently touching the familiar things, washpots, the fence posts, knowing that it was for the last time. For days, the Black Murrays had caught only glimpses of the White Murrays. Matilda wept. "Lord, I hates to think what day's goin' through. I swears I does." Tom Murray had retired for the night within his wagon when he heard the light knocking at the tailgate. Somehow he knew who was there even before he opened the end flap. Old George Johnson stood there, his face working with emotion, his hands wringing his hat. "Tom, like a word with you, if you got time." Climbing down from the wagon, Tom Murray followed old George Johnson off away in the moonlight. When finally old George stopped, he was so choked with embarrassment and emotion that he could hardly talk. "Me and Martha been talkin'. Just seem like y'all the only folks we got. Tom, we been wonderin' if y'all let us go along where you goin'." It was a while before Tom spoke. "If it was just my family, I could tell you right now, but it's a lot mo'. I just have to talk it over wid 'em all. I let you know." Tom went to each other wagon, knocking gently, calling out the men. Gathering them, he told them what happened. There was a moment of heavy quiet. Tom Murray offered. "He was 'bout the best overseer for us I ever heard of, 'cause he wasn't no real overseer at all. He worked wid us shoulder to shoulder." There was sharp opposition from some of it anti-white, but after a while someone spoke quietly. "He can't help it if he white." Finally a vote was taken, and a majority said that the Johnsons could go. 1 day's delay was necessary to build a rockaway for old George and Martha. Then the next sunup, a single-file caravan of 29 covered rockaways went creaking and groaning off the Murray place into the dawn. Ahead of the wagons rode the derbied and scarfed 67-year-old Chicken George, carrying his old one-eyed fighting rooster atop his horse, old Bob. Behind him, Tom Murray drove the first wagon, with Irene beside him, and behind them, goggle-eyed in excitement, were their children, the youngest of them the 2-year-old Cynthia. And after 27 more wagons, whose front seats held black or biracial men and their wives, finally the anchor wagon's seat held old George and Martha Johnson, who soon were peering to see clearly through the haze of dust raised by all the hoofs and wheels moving ahead of them toward what Chicken George had sworn would prove to be the promised land. Chapter 114. "Dis it?" asked Tom. "The promised land?" asked Matilda. "Where dem pigs and watermelons poppin' out in de ground?" asked one of the children, as Chicken George reined his horse to a halt. Ahead of them was a clearing in the woods with a few wooden storefronts at the intersection of the rutted road they were on and another one crossing it at right angles. 3 white men, one sitting on a nail keg, another in a rocker, the third propped on the back legs of a stool with his back to a clapboard wall and his feet on a hitching post, nudged one another and nodded at the line of dusty wagons and their passengers. A couple of white boys rolling a hoop stopped in their tracks and stared, the hoop rolling on beyond them into the middle of the road, where it twirled a few times and fell. An elderly black man sweeping off a stoop looked at them impassively for a long moment and then broke into a small, slow smile. A large dog that was scratching himself beside a rain barrel paused, leg in the air, to cock his head at them, then went back to scratching. "I done tole y'all dis here a new settlement," said Chicken George, talking fast. "Dey's only 100 or so white folks livin' round here yet, and even with just our 15 wagons left after all them that dropped off to settle on the way here, we's just about gone double the population. We's gettin' in on de ground floor of a growin' town." "Well, ain't nothin' it can do but grow, dat's sho," said Lil George without smiling. "Just wait till y'all sees de prime farmland dey got," said his father brightly, rubbing his hands with anticipation. "Probably swamp," muttered Ashford, wisely not loud enough for Chicken George to hear. But it was prime, rich and loamy, 30 acres of it for every family, scattered on checkerboard plots from the outskirts of town all the way to the white-owned farms that already occupied the best land in Lauderdale County, on the banks of the Hatchie River 6 miles to the north. Many of the white farms were as large as all of their property put together, but 30 acres was 30 more than any of them had ever owned before, and they had their hands full with that. Still living in their cramped wagons, the families began grubbing up stumps and clearing brush the next morning. Soon the furrows had been plowed and their first crops planted. Mostly cotton, some corn, with plots for vegetables and a patch for flowers. As they set about the next task of sawing down trees and splitting logs to build their cabins, Chicken George circulated from one farm to another on his horse, volunteering his advice on construction and trumpeting how he had changed their lives. Even among Henning's white settlers, he boasted about how those he had brought with him were going to help the town grow and prosper, not failing to mention that his middle son Tom would soon be opening the area's first blacksmith shop. One day soon afterward, 3 white men rode up to Tom's plot as he and his sons were mixing a load of mud with hog bristles to chink the walls of his half-built cabin. "Which one of you is the blacksmith?" one called from his horse. Sure that his first customers had arrived even before he could get set up for business, Tom stepped out proudly. "We hear you're figuring to open a blacksmith shop here in town," one said. "Yassa, been looking for the best spot to build it. Was thinking maybe that empty lot next to the sawmill if nobody else got his eye on it." The 3 men exchanged glances. "Well, boy," the second man went on, "no need of wasting time. We'll get right to the point. You can blacksmith, that's fine, but if you want to do it in this town, you'll have to work for a white man that owns the shop." "Had you figured on that?" Such a rage flooded up in Tom that nearly a minute passed before he could trust himself to speak. "Nah, sir, I ain't," he said slowly. "Me and my family's free peoples now. We's just looking to make our livin's like anybody else, by working hard at what we knows to do." He looked directly into the men's eyes. "If I can't own what I do with my own hands, then this ain't no place for us." The third white man said, "If that's the way you feel, I s'pect you're going to be riding a long way in the state, boy." "Well, we's used to travelin'," said Tom. "Ain't wantin' to cause no trouble nowhere, but I gotta be a man. I just wished I could have knowed how y'all felt here so my family wouldn't have troubled y'all by stoppin' at all." "Well, think about it, boy," said the second white man. "It's up to you. You people gotta learn not to let all this freedom talk go to your heads," said the first man. Turning their horses around without another word, they rode off. When the news went flashing among the farm plots, the heads of each family came hurrying to see Tom. "Son," said Chicken George, "you's knowed all yo' life how white folks is. Can't you just start out dey way? Den good as you blacksmiths. Won't take hardly no time to get 'em to turn round." "All that travelin', and now pack up and go again," exclaimed Matilda. "Don't do that to yo' family, son." Irene joined the chorus. "Tom, please, I's just tired." But Tom's face was grim. "Things don't never get better lessen you makes 'em better," he said. "Ain't stayin' nowhere I can't do what a free man got a right to do. Ain't axin' nobody else to go with us, but we packin' our wagon and leavin' tomorrow." "I'm comin' too," said Ashford angrily. That night Tom went out walking by himself, weighed down by guilt at the new hardship he was imposing upon his family. He played back in his mind the ordeal they had all endured in the wagons, rolling for weeks on end, and he thought of something Matilda had said often. "You search hard enough in somethin' bad, you's just liable to find somethin' good." When the idea struck him, he kept walking for another hour, letting the plan become a picture in his mind. Then he strode quickly back to the wagon where his family was sleeping and went to bed. In the morning, Tom told James and Louis to build temporary lean-tos for Irene and the children to sleep in, for he would need the wagon. As the family stood around watching him in amazement, Ashford with rising disbelief and fury, he unloaded the heavy anvil with Virgil's help, and mounted it atop a newly sawed stump. By noon he had set up a makeshift forge. With everyone still staring, he next removed the canvas top of the wagon, then its wooden sides, leaving the bare flatbed, on which he now went to work with his heaviest tools. Gradually they began to perceive the astounding idea that Tom was turning into a reality. By the end of that week, Tom drove right through town with his rolling blacksmith shop, and there wasn't a man, woman, or child who didn't stand there gaping at the anvil, forge, and cooling tub, with racks holding a neat array of blacksmithing tools, all mounted sturdily on a wagon bed reinforced with heavy timbers. Nodding politely at all the men he met, white and black, Tom asked if they had blacksmithing jobs he could do at reasonable rates. Within days, his services were being requested at more and more farms around the new settlement, for no one could think of a good reason why a black man shouldn't do business from a wagon. By the time they realized that he was doing far better with his rolling shop than he ever could have done with a stationary one, Tom had made himself so indispensable around town that they couldn't afford to raise any objections even if they'd wanted to. But they didn't really want to, because Tom seemed to them the kind of man who did his job and minded his own business, and they couldn't help respecting that. In fact, the whole family soon established themselves as decent Christian folk who paid their bills and kept to themselves, and stayed in their place, as old George Johnson said a group of white men had put it in a conversation he'd overheard down at the general store. But old George, too, was treated as one of them, shunned socially, kept waiting in stores till all the other white customers had been taken care of, even informed by a merchant that he'd bought a hat that he tried on and put back on the shelf when he found it was too small. He told the family about it later, perching the hat atop his head for them, and everybody laughed as hard as he did. "I's surprised that hat don't fit," cracked little George, "dumb as you is to try it on in that stove." Ashford, of course, got so angry that he threatened, emptily, to go down there and stuff it down that Peckerwood's throat. However little use the white community had for them, and vice versa, Tom and the others knew very well that the town's tradesmen could hardly contain their elation at the brisk increase in business they'd been responsible for. Though they made most of their own clothes, raised most of their own food, and cut most of their own lumber, the quantities of nails, corrugated tin, and barbed wire they bought over the next couple of years testified to the rate at which their own community was growing. With all their houses, barns, sheds, and fences built by 1874, the family, led by Matilda, turned its attention to an enterprise they considered no less important to their welfare, the construction of a church to replace the makeshift bush arbors that had been serving as their place of worship. It took almost a year, and much of their savings, but when Tom, his brothers, and their boys had finished building the last pew, and Irene's beautiful white hand-woven cloth, emblazoned with a purple cross, had been draped over the pulpit in front of the $250 stained glass window they'd ordered from Sears, Roebuck, everyone agreed that the New Hope Colored Methodist Episcopal Church was well worth the time, effort, and expense it represented. So many people attended the service that first Sunday, just about every black person within 20 miles who could walk or be carried, that the crowd spilled out the doors and windows and across the lawn surrounding it. But nobody had any trouble hearing every word of the ringing sermon delivered by the Reverend Silas Henning, a former slave of the Dr. D.C. Henning, an Illinois Central Railroad executive with extensive land holdings around town. In the course of his oration, Lil George whispered to Virgil that the Reverend seemed to be under the impression that he was Dr. Henning, but no one within earshot would have dared to question the fervor of his preaching. After the last heartrending chorus of "The Old Rugged Cross," again led by Matilda, looking more radiant than Chicken George had ever seen her, the congregation dried their eyes and filed out past the preacher, pumping his hand and slapping him on the back. Retrieving their picnic baskets on the porch, they spread sheets on the lawn and proceeded to relish the fried chicken, pork chop sandwiches, deviled eggs, potato salad, coleslaw, pickles, cornbread, lemonade, and so many cakes and pickles that even Lil George was gasping for breath when he finished the last slice. As they all sat chatting, or strolled around, the men and boys in coat and tie, the older women all in white, the girls in bright-colored dresses with a ribbon at the waist, Matilda watched misty-eyed as her brood of grandchildren ran about tirelessly playing tag and catch. Turning finally to her husband and putting her hand on his, gnarled and scarred with gamecock scratches, she said quietly, "I won't never forget this day, George. We done come a long way since you first come courtin' me with that derby hat of yours. Our family done growed up and had chilluns of they own, and the Lawd seen fit to keep us all together. The onliest thing I wish is you Mammy Kizzy could be here to see it with us." Eyes brimming, Chicken George looked back at her. "She lookin', baby, she sho is." Chapter 115. Promptly at the noon hour on Monday, during their break from the fields, The children started filing into church for their first day of school indoors. For the past 2 years, ever since she came to town after being one among the first graduating class from Lane College in Jackson, Tennessee, Sister Carrie White had been teaching out under the bush arbors, and this use of the church was a great occasion. The New Hope CME stewards, Chicken George, Tom, and his brothers, had contributed the money to buy pencils, tablets, and primers on readin', writin', and arithmetic. Since she taught all the children of school age at the same time, in her 6th grade, Sister Carrie had pupils ranging from 5 to 15, including Tom's oldest 5, Maria Jane, who was 12, Ellen, Viney, Lil Matilda, Elizabeth, who was 6. Young Tom, next in line, began the year after that, and then Cynthia, the youngest. By the time Cynthia was graduated in 1883, Maria Jane had dropped out, gotten married, and given birth to her first child, and Elizabeth, who was the best student in the family, had taught their father Tom Murray how to write his name and had even become his blacksmithing bookkeeper. He needed one, for by this time he had become so successful with his rolling blacksmith shop that he had also built a stationary one, without a murmur of objection, and was among the more prosperous men in town. About a year after Elizabeth went to work for her father, she fell in love with John Toland, a newcomer to Henning who had gone to work sharecropping on the 600-acre farm of a white family out near the Hatchie River. She had met him in one town one day at the general store and been impressed, she told her mother Irene, not only by his good looks and muscular build, but also by his dignified manner and obvious intelligence. He could even write a little, she noticed, when he signed for a receipt. Over the next several weeks, during the walks she'd take with him in the woods once or twice each week, she also found out that he was a young man of fine reputation, a church-goer, who had ambitions of saving up enough to start a farm of his own, and that he was as gentle as he was strong. It wasn't until they'd seen each other regularly for almost 2 months and had begun to talk secretly about marriage that Tom Murray, who had known about them from the start, ordered her to stop skulking around and bring him home from church the following Sunday. Elizabeth did as she was told. John Toland couldn't have been friendlier or more respectful when he was introduced to Tom Murray, who was even more taciturn than usual, and excused himself after only a few minutes of painful pleasantries. After John Toland left, Elizabeth was called by Tom Murray, who said sternly, "It's plain to see from the way you act round that boy that you's stuck on him. You two got anything in mind?" "What you mean, Pappy?" she stuttered, flushing hotly. "Gettin' married, that's on your mind, ain't it?" She couldn't speak. "You done told me. Well, I'd like to give you my blessin's, 'cause I wants you to be happy much as you does. He seem like a good man, but I can't let you hitch up wid him." Elizabeth looked at him uncomprehendingly. "He too high yaller. He could nigh but pass fo' white, just not quite. He ain't fish or fowl. You understand what I's sayin'? He too light fo' black folks, too dark fo' white folks. He can't help what he look like. But don't care how hard he try, he never gonna belong nowhere. And you gotta think about what yo' chillens might look like. I don't want that kind of life for you, 'Lizabeth. But Pappy, everybody like John. If'n we gets long wid old George Johnson, why can't we get long wid him? Ain't the same. But Pappy," she was desperate, "you talk about people not 'ceptin' him. You's the one ain't." "That's 'nough. You done said all I'm gonna hear about it. You ain't got the sense to keep away from that kind of grief. I gotta do it fo' you. I don't want you seeing him no mo'." "But Pappy," she was sobbing, "it's over wit, that's all is to it. If'n I can't marry John, ain't never goin' marry nobody," Elizabeth screamed. Tom Murray turned and strode from the room, slamming the door. In the next room he stopped. "Tom, what do you—" Irene began, sitting up rigidly in her rocker. "Ain't got no mo' to say about it," he snapped, marching out the front door. When Matilda found out about it, she got so angry that Irene had to restrain her from confronting Tom. "That boy's pappy got white blood in him," she shouted. Suddenly wincing, then clutching at her chest, Matilda lurched against a table. Irene caught her as she toppled to the floor. "Oh my God," she moaned, her face contorted with pain. "Sweet Jesus, oh Lawd, no!" Her eyelids fluttered and closed. "Grandmammy!" Irene shouted, seizing her around the shoulders. "Grandmammy!" She put her head to her chest and listened. There was still a heartbeat, but 2 days later it stopped. Chicken George didn't cry, but there was something heartbreaking about his stoniness, the deadness in his eyes. From that day on, no one could remember him ever smiling again or saying a civil word to anyone. He and Matilda had never seemed really close, but when she died, somehow his own warmth died with her, and he began to shrink, dry up, grow old almost overnight, not turning feeble and weak-minded, but hard and mean-tempered. Refusing to live any more in the cabin he had shared with Matilda, he began to roost with one son or daughter after another until both he and they were fed up, when old gray-headed Chicken George moved on. When he wasn't complaining, he'd usually sit on the porch in the rocker he took along with him and stare fiercely out across the fields for hours at a time. He had just turned 83, having cantankerously refused to touch a bite of the birthday cake that was baked for him, and was sitting late in the winter of 1890 in front of the fire at his eldest granddaughter's Maria Jane's house. She had ordered him to sit still and rest his bad leg while she hurried out to the adjacent field with her husband's lunch. When she returned as quickly as she could, she found him lying on the hearth, where he dragged himself after falling into the fire. Maria Jane's screams brought her husband running. The derby hat, scarf, and sweater were smoldering, and Chicken George was burned horribly from his head to his waist. Late that night he died. Nearly everyone black in Henning attended his funeral, dozens of them his children, grandchildren, or great-grandchildren. Standing there by the grave as he was lowered into the ground beside Matilda, his son Lil George leaned to Virgil and whispered, "Pappy so tough, spec he wouldn't a never died natural." Virgil turned and looked sadly at his brother. "I loved him," he said quietly. "You too, and all us." "Course we did," said Lil George. "Nobody couldn't stand living with the cockadoodlin' ol' rascal. And look now at everybody snufflin' 'cause he gone." Chapter 116. "Mama!" Cynthia breathlessly exclaimed to Irene. "Will Palmer done ax to walk me home from church next Sunday. He ain't exactly one to rush into things, is he? Least 2 years I seen him watchin' you in church every Sunday," said Irene. "Who?" Tom asked. "Will Palmer. Is it all right for him to walk her home?" After a while Tom Murray said dryly, "I'd think about it." Cynthia went off looking as if she had been stabbed, leaving Irene studying her husband's face. "Tom, ain't nobody good enough for yo' gals. Anybody in town know dat young Will just 'bout run de lumber company fo' dat old stay-drunk Mr. James. Folks all over Henning seen him unload de lumber off de freight cars hisself, sell it and deliver it hisself, then write out the bills, collect the money, and posit it in the bank hisself. Even do different little carpenterin' to customers' needs and ax nothin' fo' it. And wid all dat fo' whatever lil he make, he don't never speak a hard word 'gainst ol' Mr. James. The way I sees it, doin' his job and mindin' his own business," said Tom Murray. "I sees him in church, too. Half of de gals in dere battin' dey eyes at him." "'Cause dey is," said Irene. "'Cause he de best catch in Henning. But he ain't never yet axed to walk none home. How about dat Lula Carter he gave them flowers to?" Astonished that Tom even knew, Irene said, "Dat more'n a year ago, Tom. And if you know so much, reckon you also know she carried on like sich a fool after dat, fawnin' round him like a shadow. He finally quit talkin' her at all. He done it once, he could do it again. Not to Cynthia, he ain't. Not much sense as she got. Long wid bein' pretty and well raised. She done told me much as she like Will. She ain't never let on to him how she feel. Most she ever say is howdy and smile back when he do. Don't care how many gals buzzin' after him. You see who he buzzin' after." "See you got everything worked out," said Tom. Irene pleaded, "Aw, Tom, let him walk the child home. Least let him get together. They stays together's up to them." "And me," Tom said sternly. He did not want to seem too easy to any of his daughters, his wife either. Above all, he did not want Irene aware that before now he had seen the potential, had weighed it, and thoroughly approved of Will Palmer if the time came. Having watched young Will since he had come to Henning, Tom privately had often wished that either of his 2 sons showed half of young Will's gumption. In fact, the deviously serious, ambitious, highly capable Will Palmer reminded Tom of a younger himself. No one had expected that the courtship would develop so fast. 10 months later, in the company room of Tom and Irene's new 4-room house, Will proposed to Cynthia, who barely could restrain her "yes" until he had finished speaking. The 3rd Sunday from then, they were married in the New Hope CME Church, in a ceremony attended by well over 200 people, about half of whom had come from North Carolina on the wagon train, and who now lived on farms scattered throughout Lauderdale County. Will, with his own hands and tools, built their small home where, a year later, in 1894, their first child, a son, was born, who died within a few days. By now, Will Palmer never took off a weekday from work, the lumber company's hard-drinking owner being so far gone into the bottle that Will practically was running the entire business. Going over the company's books one stormy late Friday afternoon, Will discovered a bank payment overdue that day at People's Bank. He rode his horse 8 miles through drenching rains to knock at the bank president's back porch. "Mr. Vaughn," he said, "this payment slipped Mr. James' mind, and I know he wouldn't want to keep you waiting till Monday." Invited inside to dry, he said, "No thank you, sir, Cynthia will be wondering where I am," and wishing the banker a good night, he rode back off in the rain. The banker, deeply impressed, told the incident all over town. In the fall of 1893, someone came and told Will he was wanted at the bank. Puzzled throughout the few minutes' walk there, Will found inside, waiting for him, Henning's 10 leading white businessmen, all seeming red-faced and embarrassed. Banker Vaughn explained, speaking rapidly, that the lumber company's owner had declared bankruptcy, with plans to move elsewhere with his family. "Henning needs the lumber company," said the banker. "All of us you see here have been weeks discussing it, and we can't think of anyone better to run it than you, Will. We've agreed to co-sign a note to pay off the company's debts for you to take over as the new owner." Tears trickling down his cheeks, Will Palmer walked wordlessly along the line of white men, as he double-gripped and squeezed each hand. Then that man hurriedly signed the note, and even more quickly left with tears in his own eyes. When they had all gone, Will wrung the banker's hand for a long moment. "Mr. Vaughn, I've got one more favor to ask. Would you take half of my savings and make out a check for Mr. James, without his ever knowing where it came from?" Within a year, Will's credo, to provide the best possible goods and service for the lowest possible price, was drawing customers even from adjoining towns, and wagon loads of people, mostly black, were coming from as far away as Memphis, 48 miles to the south, to see with their own eyes Western Tennessee's first black-owned business of its kind, where Cynthia had hung ruffled, starched curtains in the windows, and Will had painted the sign on the front, "W.E. Palmer Lumber Company." Chapter 117. Cynthia's and Will's prayers were answered in 1895 with the birth of the sound, healthy girl whom they named Bertha George, the George after Will's father. Cynthia insisted on assembling a house full of family before whom she told the gurgling infant the whole story back to the African Kunta Kinte, just as Tom Murray had told it to all of his children at intervals when they had been young. Will Palmer respected Cynthia's devotion to her ancestors' memory, but it irritated his own deep pride to be considered as having married into Cynthia's family rather than the other way around. It was probably why he began to monopolize little Bertha even before she could walk. Every morning he carried her about before he left for work. Every night he tucked her into the little crib that he had made with his hands for her. By the time Bertha was 5, the rest of the family and much of the town's black community quoted Cynthia, and speaking for themselves echoed her opinion. "Will Palmer just spoilin' that gal to pieces." He had arranged that she had credit at every Henning store that sold candy, and he paid the bill each month, though he made her keep an accounting, which he solemnly checked to teach her business. As her 15th birthday present, when he opened a Sears Roebuck mail-order account in her name, the people shook and wagged their heads in mingled astonishment, dismay, and pride. All dat young'un got to do is pick what she like out in dat picture catalog, and write off de order blank, and first thing you knows, Dem Sears Roebuck white folks way yonder in Chicago done sent it. Seen it with dese here eyes. And her daddy pays for it. You hearin' what I'm tellin' you, child? Anything dat Bertha want." Later that same year, Will hired a teacher to come weekly all the way from Memphis to give Bertha piano lessons. She was a gifted pupil, and before long was playing for the choir in the New Hope-colored Methodist Episcopal Church, of which Will was the senior trustee and Cynthia was the perennial president of the stewardess board. When Bertha finished the local 8th grade in June of 1909, there was no question that she would be leaving Henning to attend the CME church-supported Lane Institute 30 miles to the east in Jackson, Tennessee, which went from 9th grade through 2 years of college. Gal, just no way you can know what it mean, you bein' this family's first one headin' for a college. Ma, if I can ever get you and Pa to please quit saying such as dis and fo. I keep telling you they're pronounced this and for. Anyway, isn't that why colleges are there? For people to go to? Cynthia wept when she got alone with her husband. Lord, God help us wid her, Will. She just don't understand. Maybe she best don't, he tried to console. I just know I'll draw my last breath seein' she have better chance than us did. As was only expected of her, Bertha achieved consistently high grades, studying pedagogy, to become a teacher, and she both played the piano and sang in the school choir. On one of her 2 weekend visits back home every month, she persuaded her father to have a sign painted on both doors of his delivery truck, Henning 121, your lumber number. Telephones recently had come to Henning. It was typical of Bertha's ready wit, which got quoted often around town. On later visits, Bertha began to speak about a young man whom she had met in college choir. His name, Simon Alexander Haley, and he was from a town named Savannah, Tennessee. Being very poor, she said, he was working at as many as 4 odd jobs at the time in order to stay in school, where he was studying agriculture. When Bertha continued to talk about him a year later, in 1913, Will and Cynthia suggested that she invite him to visit with them in Henning, so they could appraise him as a person. The New Hope CME church was packed on the Sunday it had been circulated that Bertha's beau from college would be in attendance. He arrived under the searching scrutiny not only of Will and Cynthia Palmer, but also of the total black community. But he seemed a very self-assured young man. After singing a baritone solo in the garden, accompanied by Bertha at the piano, he talked easily with all who crowded about him later out in the churchyard. He looked everyone squarely in the eyes, firmly gripping all of the men's hands, and tipping his hat to all of the ladies. Bertha and her Simon Alexander Haley, his full name, returned to Lane College together on the bus that evening. No one had a thing to say against him, publicly, in the ensuing community discussions. Privately, though, some queasy uncertainties were expressed concerning his very nearly high-yaller complexion. He had told dark brown Bertha in confidence that his parents, former slaves, had both told him of having slave mothers and Irish white fathers. Paternally an overseer named Jim Bow, of whom little else was known, and maternally a Marion County, Alabama plantation scion and later Civil War colonel named James Jackson. But it was agreed by all that he sang well, that he seemed to have been well raised, and he showed no signs of trying to put on airs just because he was educated. Haley landed a summer's work as a Pullman porter, saving every possible penny to enable his transferring to the 4-year A&T College in Greensboro, North Carolina, exchanging weekly letters with Bertha. When World War I came, he and all other males in their senior class enlisted en masse in the U.S. Army, and before long his letters to Bertha came from France, where in the Argonne Forest, in 1918, he was gassed. After treatment for several months in a hospital overseas, he was returned home to convalesce, and in 1919, fully recovered, he came again to Henning, and he and Bertha announced their engagement. Their wedding in the New Hope CME Church in the summer of 1920 was Henning's first social event attended by both black and white, not only since Will Palmer by now was among the town's most prominent citizens, but also because, in her own right, the accomplished, irrepressible Bertha was someone whom all in Henning regarded with pride. The reception was held on the wide, sloping lawn of the Palmers' brand-new home of 10 rooms, including a music parlor and a library. A banquet of food was served. More presents were heaped than were normally seen at an average 3 weddings. There was even a recital by the Full Lane College Choir, in whose ranks the ecstatic newlyweds had met, which had come in the bus that Will Palmer had chartered from Jackson. Late that day, Henning's little railroad depot was overrun as Simon and Bertha boarded the Illinois Central train that took them through the night to Chicago, where they changed onto another bound for somewhere called Ithaca, New York. Simon was going to study for his master's degree in agriculture at some Cornell university, and Bertha would be enrolling at a nearby Ithaca Conservatory of Music. For about 9 months, Bertha wrote home regularly, reporting their exciting experiences so far away and telling how happy they were with each other. But then, in the nearly summer of 1921, Bertha's letters began to arrive less and less often, until finally Cynthia and Will grew deeply concerned that something was wrong that Bertha wasn't telling them about. Will gave Cynthia $500 to send to Bertha, telling Bertha to use it however they might need it, without mentioning it to Simon. But their daughter's letters came even more seldom, until by late August, Cynthia told Will and their closest friends that she was going to New York herself to find out what was the matter. 2 days before Cynthia was due to leave, a midnight knocking at the front door awakened them in alarm. Cynthia was first out of bed, snatching on her robe, with Will close behind. At their bedroom's doorway, she could see through the living room's glass-paneled French doors the moonlit silhouettes of Bertha and Simon on the front porch. Cynthia went shrieking and bounding to snatch open the door. Bertha said calmly, "Sorry we didn't write. We wanted to bring you a surprise present." She handed to Cynthia the blanketed bundle in her arms, her heart pounding, and with Will gazing incredulously over her shoulder, Cynthia pulled back the blanket's top fold, revealing a round brown face. The baby boy, 6 weeks old, was me.